Hello and welcome back to In the Clouds Ground School. This is Dr. Krista Morrison, and let's move on to understanding the requirements that we have to operate in the IFR environment. Our objectives today are to be able to describe the requirements to operate in instrument conditions, explain and list the required equipment and documents to ensure the airworthiness of an aircraft, describe the procedures for operating an aircraft with inoperative equipment, and list the inspections required to maintain airworthiness. So I'm going to start by looking at what are the requirements that we need as pilots to operate in an IFR environment. So remember, IFR means Instrument Meteorological Conditions or Instrument Flight Rules. So we have to have an instrument rating whenever we are flying in instrument meteorological conditions, i.e. clouds, flying in Class A airspace. So again, Class A airspace is the only airspace that requires an IFR rating at all times. So you can't even so much as stick your nose into Class A airspace without an instrument rating. Fly for hire carrying cargo or passengers at night over 50 nautical miles. Now, it can be helpful when we want to avoid any rerouting, rescheduling, or canceling of a flight because of weather. And it's nice to have if we want a margin of safety by having ATC or air traffic control follow us. Of course, we can always ask for VFR flight following, but remember, VFR flight following is only if the controllers have the ability to do so. So they don't have to follow you when you're on VFR flight following, but they do have to follow you when you are filed on an IFR flight plan. So now that we understand what we have to operate in the IFR environment as pilots, what are we required to have for airworthiness? This is required under 14 CFR 91.203. So we have to have the airworthiness certificate. This is the FAA Form 8100-2 Standard Airworthiness Certificate, or the FAA Form 8130-7, the Special Airworthiness Certificate. The Registration Certificate, which is FAA Form 8D50-3. The radio station license if we are flying international flights. So if we say we want to go to Bermuda or we want to fly the Bahamas, we have to have that radio station license, which is FCC Form 605. The operating limitations, this is in the form of either the FAA approved airplane flight manual or the pilot's operating handbook, and a current up-to-date weight and balance. What exactly is the Airworthiness Directive? Well, under 14 CFR 39, these are mandatory, legally enforceable regulations that are issued by the FAA. These cannot be overflown. So if an AD comes along, you have to make sure that you comply with it. Otherwise, the aircraft is not able to fly legally. You may not overfly this. So if it says it has to be done by 200 hours, you cannot fly it at 201 hours. It does usually require an inspection or repairs or limitations. There is usually a provision somewhere in there to allow operators to fly the aircraft to do the work. So let's say you have an area that maybe you live in the middle of the mountains in Montana, and the closest place that can do the work might be in Salt Lake City, Utah. Obviously, they're going to allow you to fly that aircraft to Salt Lake City to take care of it. These are issued to either correct an unsafe condition in what they call the product. This is verbatim from the FAA. Correct an unsafe condition in the product, meaning an aircraft, the engines, propellers, or any devices on the aircraft. Correct a condition that is likely to exist or develop in products of the same type. So, for instance, several years ago, there was a crash of Piper Arrow on a check ride due to a wing spar issue. AD was put out for all aircraft of that same type to have the wing spars inspected and, if necessary, fixed for any type of corrosion. So there are 3 types of airworthiness directives. Again, this is directly from 14 CFR 39. So they have a notice of proposed rulemaking. So they're going to let you know, hey, something's coming down the pipe. There's going to be a final rule that's going to have a request for comments. So let's say they want to know, hey, here's our final rule. Go ahead and give us your comments. Tell us what you think, kind of thing. And then they're going to issue emergency airworthiness directives, which are ADs that come out to immediately fix a problem that they know is going to cause serious harm or damage either to persons or to the aircraft. So remember that these are issued when there is an unsafe condition that exists in a product. Again, engine, aircraft, and such. The unsafe condition that's likely to exist or develop in a product of the same design, again, wing spars in the Piper low wing aircraft. They are going to be published in the Federal Register or the FAA Regulatory and Guidance Library. They might have intervals. So they can be a one-time AD, meaning that they only require a one-time modification. They can have a recurring AD, but that requires a check or service to be performed at specific intervals on an ongoing basis. And then they have not applicable ADs, and these are noted to just show awareness that they do exist, but it may not be necessarily required at that time. So what are some of the required equipments under 91.205? Once we get through the whole, we have our AARO, we have our airworthiness certificate, we have our AADs, we have complied with those, we are still complying with maybe some of them. Now we have to consider what keeps us airworthy. So in order to be considered airworthy under 91.205, aircraft have to have certain equipment installed and working. Now you may remember way back when you did your private, the acronym A Tomato Flames or A Tomato Flames flaps. We're going to add a next one, and that is grab card. That is usually for IFR. So if we remember back to A Tomato Flames, these are the required equipment for day VFR. So A, airspeed indicator. T, tachometer for each engine. O, oil pressure gauge for each engine using a pressure system. M, manifold pressure gauge for each altitude engine. A for altimeter. T for temperature gauge for each liquid-cooled engine. O, oil temperature gauge for each air-cooled engine. F, fuel gauge that indicates the quantity in each tank. L, landing gear position indicator for aircraft with retractable landing gear. A, anti-collision lights must be aviation red or white. M, magnetic direction indicator. E, emergency locator transmitter. And S, safety equipment including safety belts, chrono harnesses for each occupant 2 years or older. If operated for hire over water, you are required to have an approved flotation gear for each occupant and a pyrotechnic signaling device. Now we can move on to the required equipment for night VFR flight. So you have to have everything in that day VFR. So remember we saw that A Tomato Flames flaps. This is where the flaps comes in. You're going to have fuses, 1 spare set or 3 spare fuses for each kind required and accessible. A landing light if operated for hire. Anti-collision light, position lights, and a source of electrical energy for all installed electrical and radio equipment. Let's look at the IFR. So I put D in and then grab card. So this is how I remember it. All the equipment for day VFR, all the equipment for night VFR. Now we have to have a generator or alternator, radios, altimeter that is pressure sensitive, a ball or slip skid indicator, a clock with a second hand. So technically your Apple Watch or your Garmin watch actually doesn't count. You do have to have an actual clock with a second hand. Artificial horizon, otherwise known as the gyroscopic pitch and bank indicator, the rate of turn indicator, a directional gyro, and if you're flying above flight level 240 or 24,000 feet and above, you are required to have DME. or distance measuring equipment. Now, what happens if you find out that you have some inoperative equipment or instruments? Under 14 CFR 91.213, you cannot take off with inoperative instruments or equipment installed unless the aircraft has an approved minimum equipment list. You'll see a lot of these at the Part 121 or Part 135s and some 91 operators. You may or may not actually see it in general aviation, but you will definitely see this if you are at an airline. An aircraft that has a letter of authorization from the Flight Standards Office, and none of the required instruments for day VFR or kinds of operations list are inoperative. So depending on what you are flying, you cannot have those listed as inoperative. And if there are inoperative instruments, they must be removed or placarded as inoperative and deactivated. So that's where you get that INOPS little sticker that needs to be put on top of it. Now we can look at some of the required inspections. So even though we have all of that we've complied with ADs, we have all of our instruments ready to go, everything works out perfectly, we still have to inspect them. So aircraft have to have specific inspections to remain airworthy. We often remember this by the term Aviate or AV1, that is a 1, not an I, ATE as a common acronym. It requires each system and certain instruments to be inspected on a specific schedule. So these required inspections include A, the annual inspection including any airworthiness directives that exist. This has to be done every 12 calendar months. It is regulated under 14 CFR 91.409, and it may be must be performed by an airframe and power plant with an inspection authorization. V, VOR check every 30 days. 14 CFR 91.171 is our regulation, and this can be done by any pilot. 1, or the I, the 100-hour inspection. Every 100 hours, however, be careful, the 100 hours only for aircraft being used for training or for hire. Not required if you are just flying your Cessna 172 that you personally own. You don't have to have a 100-hour done unless you rent it out. This is under 14 CFR 91.409, and this is performed by any airframe and power plant mechanic. A, altimeter and static system. Every 24 calendar months, regulated under 14 CFR 91.411. As a manufacturer, the repair station or mechanic with an airframe rating may perform this. The next one is T for transponder. Every 24 calendar months, it is 14 CFR 91.413. Any certificated repair station, manufacturer, holder of a continuous airworthiness maintenance program. E for ELT. Every 12 months, but if it has been used, and the battery must be replaced or recharged if used for more than 1 hour of cumulative use or 50% of its useful life is expired. It is regulated on 14 CFR 91.207, and it is the same as transponders. So the next thing is to do a VOR check. It must be performed every 30 days. It can be performed by any pilot. According to the Instrument Flying Handbook, you are to rotate the OBS to move the CDI from center to the last dot and note the numbers of degree of change. So now what is the tolerances that we need to note? So plus or minus 4 degrees if it is the dual VOR check, a ground check, a VOT or testing VOR, or repair station. If you are airborne, it is plus or minus 6 degrees. So in this presentation, we discussed the requirements to operate in the IFR environment, the required documentation that we need to have on board to ensure that our aircraft is airworthy, the airworthiness directives, any required equipment that we have to have on board, the procedures for operating with inoperative equipment and instruments, required inspections, and VOR checks. Now to move on to some of the test questions that we may see. Again, we are not going to see all of them. So I highly recommend that while going along with these videos, you should be going along with Shepherd Air, Sporty's, or King Schools, or some other test prep software. So when the CDI noodle is centered during an airborne VOR check, the Omni-Bearing Selector, OBS, and the OBS indicator should read A, within 6 degrees of the selected radio, B, within 4 degrees of the selected radio, or C, 0 degrees to, but only if you are due south of the VOR. So the answer is A, within 6 degrees of the selected radio. So here's the explanation. FAR 91.17b states, if neither a test signal nor a designated checkpoint on the surface is available, use an airborne checkpoint designated by the administrator or outside the United States by an appropriate authority. The maximum permissible bearing error is plus or minus 6 degrees. The pilot in command of a civil aircraft must have an instrument rating only when operating A, under IFR in weather conditions less than the minimum for VFR flight or in Class A airspace, B, under IFR in positive control airspace, or C, in weather conditions less than the minimum prescribed for VFR flight. And the answer here is A, operating in Class A airspace or in weather conditions in IMC or less than VMC must hold an instrument pilot certificate with an instrument rating. To carry passengers for hire in an airplane on a cross-country flights of more than 50 nautical miles from the departure, the pilot in command is required to hold at least A, a commercial pilot certificate with an instrument rating, B, a Category 2 pilot authorization, or C, a first-class medical certificate. And again, here the answer is A, to carry passengers for hire on a cross-country flight over 50 nautical miles or at night, you require a commercial pilot certificate with an instrument rating. We refer to figure 82 in the corner, which is an acceptable range of accuracy when performing an operation check of dual VORs using one system against another, A, 1, B, 2, or C, 4. So the answer here is C. For dual VOR check, the acceptable tolerance is between 2 VORs is 4 degrees. RMI number 4 shows this. Both VORs do show a 210 bearing to the station. I want to thank you for tuning in today. Again, I will try to be having these out about once a week with new material. Feel free to hit, as everybody tells you, to hit the like or subscribe button. Make sure you don't miss any. I hope you have a lovely day. Enjoy yourself, and goodbye.